Hello, everybody, and welcome to our next session. I'm Jeremy Grant. I was one of the track leads for the identity verification track this year. I'm really excited to welcome my friend Ian Glazer. Ian, I'm not going to give an introduction. Everybody knows Ian pretty well, but one of the things I love about Ian is he has had a habit over the years of taking things that we do every day in identity, we often take for granted and maybe don't think about, and actually pick them apart a little bit and make us think about them and why we're doing them and if we could do them better. I will say I had one condition when I saw the name of his talk, Ceremonies, which that his walk-up music had to be New Order. So I don't know if this will work.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you so much.
All right.
It's day 2 of Identiverse. It's midday. People do not look horrifically hungover, which is a testament to your willpower, and for that, I thank you. I also thank you for taking a little bit of time. There is a ton of amazing content going on all the time, and I know it's hard to pick which session, so thank you for picking this one. I need to thank a couple of other people as well. Years ago, when this conference was called Cloud Identity Summit, and it was in Keystone, Colorado, Bob Blakely, friend, mentor, agent provocateur, gave a talk about recognition in opposition to authentication. And it was incredibly influential for me, for everyone in the room, and it should be something that we'll pick up again, this theme of recognition a little bit more. I need to thank Nishant Kaushik. He is on next. You need to stay for this, but he is constantly talking about usability and authentication, and it cannot be undervalued how important that topic is. And last but not least, I want to thank our good friend Kim Cameron. So in a quiet moment years ago, Kim and I were talking in Munich, and he talked about this notion of a ceremony, and a ceremony in the context of identity management, and it's something that's always stuck with me. So thanks to these folks. So a ceremony, well, what the heck is it? Well, let's go with good old dictionary definition. I like that first one. It's a formal act or series of acts prescribed by ritual or protocol or convention. It's things we do. We don't even think about it sometimes. And so I want to pick at this notion because there's a lot of things we do in identity management that we don't think about. And there's a real disconnect. The disconnect is between what we do in the analog world and what we do in the digital world. In the analog world, we have ceremonies of introduction, actually very formalized ceremonies of introduction. What do we have in the digital world? Registration. Yeah. What do we do in the analog world? We recognize people. There's a really interesting process by which we do this, but in the digital world, we do authentication. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about authentication ceremonies and some of our achievements and some of our challenges. But I have a thesis here which basically says our existing authentication ceremonies aren't good enough. And they're not good enough for 2 basic reasons. Number 1, they set a bar too high for everyone with whom we want to interact with at high assurance. And 2, they set a bar too low for adversaries to be prevented from clearing. This is a bad combination. So what do we do about it? Well, let's at least see what we've got and see what we're working with. So let's take a little tour. Now, our tour starts here. I know. Thank you for noticing. My slide skills have gotten so good through COVID. I mean, I don't even know how I come up with this stuff. What you don't see is a box. This is the scenario in which I go and present myself in front of a service, let's say using a web browser, and there's a very loosey-goosey kind of form of authentication that occurs. Browser fingerprinting, GeoIP, IP address. Essentially, this is a very classic sort of tracking scenario. But the user just walks up and looks at the service. Now, there was need to actually know a little bit more about the individual, and so we invented the box. Yes, I know. Again, marvel at the PowerPoint skills. And so what is this? This is a very typical, say, marketing microsite. Go to a site, I provide an identifier, typically email or phone, and I am known as that identifier subsequently. Now, I think we can all agree these are low assurance at best. And obviously we had need for higher assurance interactions. So what did we do? Well, if 1 box is good, obviously 2 is better. Now we know this one. We know this ceremony, right? This is a classic. Identifier goes here, passwords go there. This is older than some, maybe many people in the room. Well, maybe not Jeremy, but, and it's been here, and it's always been here, and it feels like it's always gonna be here. But we just didn't sit still with this, right? You know, so we innovated. We're like, oh, well, 2 boxes is cool, but what if we had another box? And this, you're gonna get some numbers. Now, this isn't actually a ceremony. Why? Because the means by which you get those numbers is totally different, right? All sorts of different experiences here. So it's not something we do out of convention, but we still do it a lot. It's a technique. And we continue to innovate. So we took this 2-box idea, we said, you know, what else can we do? Well, we can add buttons. Why? Because I don't actually want to put anything in those boxes. I want to click on a button, and it's going to take me somewhere else where I already authenticated and bring me back. This is social sign-in. Now, this works great, except it is by its very nature exclusive. You are providing 4 choices of how someone is going to authenticate if they don't want to use a username and password. So what's the solution to that? More buttons, like lots more buttons. This is the NASCAR problem, right? If I want to include regional social media providers, if I want to change what brands I'm presenting and maybe even diluting my own brand by presenting all of these cute little buttons, I have a lot of choices and challenges, and the end user doesn't really know how or what or the consistency of how this all works. But we didn't stop there. No, of course not. So, good old 2-box, we added a widget. Now, to be fair, this is like one of the biggest innovations we've had in the last decade. Because, I mean, come on, caps lock indicator, right below the pyramids of Pisa, human achievement, right there, people, right? Because then you get things like this one, which is, hey, thank you for having a very long password. Somewhere around the 12th character, you screwed it up, but you can go check it out. Or this one. So summoning a password manager, that's really powerful. That's actually a real innovation. The problem is, these are not ceremonies. Why? Because if you have multiple of them, they tend to fight. There's actually not a really conventional way to make this all work together, and it's a hodgepodge. But we knew we had to do better, and we did, in fact. There was a real moment of inspired thinking, well, probably many moments, and we came up with this pattern. This is 1 box plus 1 box. Now, it was brought to us by our friend Eric Sachs, who at the time was at Google. Does anybody remember when this got debuted at Google? Shout it out. Anybody? Really? People. Ooh, 2012. I hear 2012. Identiverse. Good, good. So this 1 box plus 1 box technique came out in May of 2015. Yes, Danny, you're right. It did start to happen at Cloud Identity Summit. And you would have thought, based on the reaction of the internet, that Google had harmed puppies to create this experience. People freaked the hell out. They collectively moved millions of peoples of cheese at the same time. But it really was innovation. Why? Well, because we basically say, here's an identifier and then something, that actually gives the service a real freedom, right? It gives that service a freedom to respond by saying, oh, hey, based on that identifier, I'm just going to bounce you over to the last social provider you used. Or I'm going to ask you for numbers, or I'm going to ask you for a hardware token, or a plain old password, or maybe I won't even do anything because you already have a session and I can just reconnect you to it. But that flexibility, that's hugely important. And so this brings me to my first point, which is, in your own worlds, see where you can separate clearly in your own thinking and in your architecture the front-end ceremony, the sort of common pattern that people interact with, from what your back-end processes and requirements are. Because that allows you to innovate both of those at different cadences. That's important. Now, we didn't just stop there. Of course not. No, what have we seen? Well, the growth of mobile devices, we've seen mobile biometrics, which typically is a pretty awesome experience because I just look at the device and I'm in the app. Now, for the most part, that is predicated on me successfully previously using a 2-box experience to sign in, but it's progress. Or we can see these things, right? This could be kick off and OAuth code flow for a device activation on a smart TV, let's say. Could be a presentation of a verified credential. Frankly, it could be anything. So we have these different kinds of techniques and conventions, and I would posit that we really only have 3 ceremonies. It's basically 0 box all the way through 1+1. And everything else is a technique because there's such inconsistencies on how this works across devices and platforms and apps and services. So far we've really only talked about when things go right, when people successfully authenticate and perform that ceremony. What about when it goes wrong? Well, in the analog world, if there's a failure to recognize someone, we actually have a very well-established process for hinting. Essentially providing a hint to the individual to say like, oh, no, you know them. For example, these hints are things like, we met on a boat, or you mistook me for David Grohl, or I am your father. Very common hints that people use all the time. But the digital world, what happens when we fail to authenticate? We have these really well-worn processes for no, okay. What we have is like kind of horrible but kind of common ways of setting a new static secret. This is a reset password. This is like the most nuclear option, but it's horribly consistent. That's a real interesting moment. In fact, I would go so far as to say username and password is successful, not because of how well it works, but how ubiquitous and consistent failure ceremonies are. When it goes wrong, people know what to do. Now, the thing they get to do maybe isn't the thing we really want them to do, or they want to do, or our adversaries do actually want them to do, but it's consistent in terms of failure ceremonies. But what about if we're not talking about username and password? Think about it in the experiences that you have either individually or as your organization or as a technology provider. When things go wrong during an authentication ceremony and it's not a username and password, is that consistent across all devices, all browsers, all of your apps, all your digital landscape? Probably isn't. And that's a real problem because we don't actually have consistent ceremonies for when things go wrong. And because of that, it means that every time when something goes wrong, it's a brand new event that someone has to actively think about how to deal with. That's a real actual load on people. That's a real cognitive burden. It does get worse, of course, because we're only about 45 slides into this thing. Of course it's going to get worse. Consider this. Authentication ceremonies are inherently private ones. Why is this? Well, it's because overwhelmingly we rely on static secrets, and by their very nature, we have to keep that secret private. But recognition ceremonies can actually be done in public. This is really powerful, right? So even if I am surrounded by a room of adversaries, colleagues, I can still recognize Danny. He can recognize me. Consider this. We take that mobile biometric scenario and we add to it the power of WebAuthn, which gets us away from static secrets. And now I think we have the beginning of a ceremony that can actually be performed in public. This is a really big deal. Yay, cryptography. Now this, authentication ceremonies are inherently solo ceremonies. Only you authenticate you. Why? Because there is an assumption that there is literally only one keyboard in the universe and you are sitting at it. We don't actually have any affordances for anything else. And yet, recognition ceremonies are not solo ceremonies. You can help a friend be recognized by someone else who they met a while ago. You can actually assist in that recognition ceremony, or another party can. That's a really big deal because there are constituents that your businesses, public or private, does not matter, want to interact with. But for a variety of reasons, maybe a child, maybe an elderly parent, not all the same devices, maybe someone who can't represent themselves. Could be someone working in a public space, like a school or a public library. These are constituents you want to interact with. But without some notion of an assisted ceremony, because there's only one keyboard in the universe, you can't. So this is my third point, is that we do lack, and this is a significant problem, public ceremonies. Ceremonies we can do in public, and ones that can be assisted. It means that we are leaving people out. And that is not what we do as identity practitioners. So, what do? Okay, we have this disconnect. Recognition and authentication are quite different, so what do we do about this? Well, I think we actually have to get back to this. I think we actually have to get back to a zero-box experience, and by that I mean this. Individual presents themselves in front of a service, they're not identified or tracked, they're actually recognized. So what does that mean? Well, that would mean something like what we do in the analog world. Consider that in different adjacent domains to ours, people are working on these problems. Think about anti-fraud technology. These technologies can actually determine whether this checkout transaction is likely to succeed and is fraudulent or not. Similarly, anti-bot technologies are saying, well, you know that entity that's on your service right now? Yeah, that's not a human. Even consider that in ad tech, which, let's be honest, is not necessarily the source of warm and fuzzy from our perspective, but they're spending a lot of time and effort ensuring that when a digital ad is presented, it's presented to a human that's meant to see it, and that person, in fact, is actually clicking on it. So the interesting thing about these adjacent technologies is, at least through a process of elimination, they can build up a low-resolution picture about who it is on their service. Now, to be clear, this is not, I know immediately this is Ian, but I at least know it's not a bot. It's likely a known entity to some degree, and we think it's human, to start. However, to sort of bridge that gap to what we want to do in terms of recognition, I think we need three things. The first is we need a language of disclosure. What I mean by that is we need a way to talk to users and say, hey, I'm going to ask for a little bit of information. Some of it may be system-level things, and some of them may be things that you provide. And I'm going to use this to recognize you in the future. And after I make that sort of initial recognition ceremony, I'll throw all that information away. Second, we need a system of hinting, and especially strong hints. In my mind, things like what WebAuthn does is possibly the strongest hint, right? We now have this very interesting cryptographic-based ceremony that can provide a real clue that the individual is at their device in this service. Those two things alone are not enough. We actually need an active client. So what I mean by an active client is this. It's a mobile operating system. It's a browser. It's a password manager. It's a wallet. It is something that is helping to broker the recognition process. Essentially, you can think of it as an assisted part of the process. And it's going to provide information with user control to help that recognition process happen. That could be just, here's my passkey. But it could be more than that. We need real clarity around active clients. So here's the thing. Whether you build authentication technologies or not, whether you deploy authentication technologies or not, we all do them. We all go through this ceremony. We do it so many times a day, we don't even think about it. And I think we can all agree that, there's some room for improvement. I think that's pretty fair to say. And from a business perspective, we've got to reach everybody, whether it's every citizen, every student, every employee, every business partner, every customer. And so we cannot be using ceremonies that are exclusive by their nature. We've got to reach everyone. How do we do that? Well, I think there's three things we can do. First is clearly separate front-end ceremony from that back-end process. Even if this is a notional separation for you and your architecture and your roadmaps, make it. Because this, again, allows you to innovate and change two important things independently. And that gives you a great amount of freedom. Second, fail consistently. Don't start with your happy path. Start with when it goes wrong during an authentication ceremony. Does it go wrong consistently across every app that I have in my digital landscape? Does it go wrong across every property, every browser, every operating system? And where it doesn't, and you don't have control, Work with organizations like FIDO and the UX guidelines to help facilitate that and encourage it. But really think about failure ceremonies or the failure scenarios first, then go on a happy path. And then lastly, and I acknowledge this is the hardest one, think about ways you can actually design assisted or group ceremonies. Now, most of our technologies do not directly afford us an opportunity to do this. But imagine that you could give your help desk, your call center, a script that would actually help them be helped by someone else during an authentication ceremony. Now, we have to figure out ways to do this securely. Obviously, what we were saying is someone else can help Ian authenticate. And that can open up a door of attack, for certain. But at least think about ways where more parties can be involved to help someone, whether they can represent themselves or not. So here's the thing. We've got this disconnect between what we do in the analog world and what we do in the digital world. And I'm positing that we have got to get to ceremonies that we do consistently, no matter sort of the digital or analog world, those being introduction and recognition. And I think it's important to get there because we need solutions that can really be used. We need ceremonies that we all are familiar with, no matter the context. And so the thing about recognition ceremonies is they are in fact usable by everyone. Everybody can be recognized. That they are reasonably high assurance. Yes, and Andre touched on this a little bit yesterday, there's some really fascinating generative things going on, but these are pretty trustable ceremonies. We've done them for centuries. And lastly, these are reasonably adversary resistant. We already know that from our own human experiences. So I think that recognition really is this right path forward. And with that, I will open up your path forward for the rest of the conference. Thank you so much, everybody. Jeremy's assisting.
Oh, sorry. Want to make sure you get your exercise. So I love your idea of like assisted authenticate. I don't remember what words you used for that. That actually happened when I came in here. Like I got my badge, or I told them my name, and they were going to ask me for my ID. But the person sitting next to them on their side, I was like, oh, hey, hi, Jen. And she was like, oh, hey, hi, Heather. And I started talking to her, and only later did I realize I didn't actually show my ID because she had recognized me and I didn't need to do that. So I guess I just want to say, like, yes, that happens in the real world, and I really think it is needed in the digital realm as well.
So in the digital realm, we do see it in places. Typically around sort of incredible emergency recovery scenarios, right? Facebook has a pattern for this, Apple has a bit of a pattern for this, and it combines both technology and sort of social to actually happen. They tend to be very technology specific, certainly in Apple's case, and in Facebook's case, they hinge on a lot of personal information disclosure. They exist, right? So it's an existence proof. We know this can be done. How do we move them from the extreme case, account recovery, to something that's more common? That's undiscovered country right now. Alan, are you standing because you have a question, or are you just going to yell at me? Oh, okay. No trouble.
Again, on the ceremony we were talking there about assisted, I think it happens a lot more in the real world than we represent in the digital domain at the moment. And I think we should represent it more so that the digital domain reflects what's going on. The assisted journeys I'm thinking of are a nephew helping an elderly person to be recognized on their device.
Yeah.
Because they don't know how it works. They can't use the touch screen or whatever it is, right? So I think there's a lot of implicit assisted journeys going on, and we should be explicit.
Think about it in your own world, then I'll get off the stage. On behalf of. Is there anything more terrifying than modeling on behalf of in your own enterprises, in your own businesses? This isn't a new thing. This is 20, 30 plus years old. And so householding and some of these other techniques, but on behalf of and assisted authentication ceremonies, these are feeling around the same edges, or different edges of the same problem space. And I'm gonna make no illusions this is easy to tackle, but I think to your point, moving from implicit, it's happening, to how do we at least begin to chip away and make it slightly more explicit, even if it's just enumeration of our use cases, is material progress. And with that, have a great rest of Identiverse, everybody.